Hi, I'm Krista DeVoe, and today I'm going to examine the case study of the missing Booster Club funds. In order to better understand and identify the problem, I'm going to examine the things that I know about the school and Mr. Stevens and the situation, and examine some of the things that I need to know in order to move forward. First of all, let's look at Mr. Stevens. He's been the principal for 4 years now. He's had the opportunity to see what things work well and what things don't work well. We see that he's very dependent on parent involvement in his school. And this is an exciting thing. They've had some socioeconomic decline in their area in recent years, and they've maintained a high level of parent involvement. That's definitely something to celebrate. We also know that that parent involvement involves student activities like sporting events, and that he does have some safeguards in place for those parents to use when they're collecting funds, such as pre-numbered tickets and concessions inventory, those sorts of things. We also know that he has relationships with those parents. For example, Mrs. Bowman, she's been volunteering in the school for years. She's had 3 kids come through. The 3rd is currently enrolled. Mr. Dumas, that he also visited with prior to a game, and that information that he gets from him causes him some concern. Because of that, he begins to question whether $50 might be missing from the funds collected during the game. And it appears as though he might suspect Mrs. Bowman. When I start to examine the things I still need to know, I'm a little curious about the game ticket funds being a Booster Club proceed. In my experience, those funds usually go into a student activity account, but it becomes apparent through the course of the passage that the Booster Club president is coordinating those parent volunteers and seems to be responsible for it. And the case study is also called the Booster Club funds. So I'm going to kind of move forward with my plan based on the idea that these funds belong to the Booster Club and not to the school, which changes Mr. Stevens' responsibilities in this situation. Another thing I need to know is, have the parent volunteers been actually trained on the safeguards that exist, and are there additional safeguards that weren't mentioned that are in place? Another question I have is, have funds ever went missing before? Before I'd want to suspect Mrs. Bowman, she's been volunteering there for years, so that would be a question I'd want to have answered. The last couple questions more have to do with those safeguards. Who was paired with Mrs. Bowman? Do they work from the same gate or separate gates? And what's the procedure for those torn tickets? Those are all questions that I have as I initially examine this. After identifying the problem, now it's time to fully name that problem. For me, the problem lies with the opportunity for theft that does exist with student activities. Now that I've identified the problem, it's time to put in place a plan of action. What things will I do? First of all, it would be important to me to document my concerns. I'd want to spend some time outlining what things seem to be problematic with the situation, maybe listing some safeguards that I think would be appropriate to have in place at this point. After I've documented those concerns, my next step would be to start asking some questions. I would want to ask questions of my district office to know if there's certain procedures that should be followed by this Booster Club. And I'd also want to talk to the Booster Club president, find out if they have any concerns that have come up over the years with the way that they're handling funds, and maybe suggest that there could be some changes made to the procedures, to the safeguards, and maybe some training that needs to happen with those parent volunteers. At that point, I would encourage that Booster Club president to schedule a meeting with those parent volunteers where we could collaborate about some of the areas where there might be concern. Maybe they've identified areas as well, and start to brainstorm and suggest some possible safeguards that would better protect our funds. It's important to remember my role as an advisor here, and not someone that's directly responsible, but someone who does have experience and could offer some leadership. I might point out some of my concerns, Suggest that we have 2 people paired at each gate, and that those people count the funds before they turn them over to the principal, who also counts the funds. That would give us 2 opportunities to account for the money. Maybe have an addition to the pre-numbered ticket procedure, which is if there's any damaged tickets, that those be stored with the tickets themselves and can be kind of inventoried directly and not just thrown away. As principal, I have to remember that I am an advisor in this situation, but I definitely want to initiate some change. This will occur over time and with the support of the community and with the support of those parent volunteers. I think it would be important to frame this as an opportunity to protect the parent volunteers as well as the funds. I would also make myself available to potentially help with those trainings of parents and maybe design some materials for the training that would help ease that transition, because I know change is often difficult. My final step in the plan of action is I want to address the situation with the Bowmans. It's a concern to me that we didn't have a better way to help Lucy be successful on her trip. And I'd like to visit with and brainstorm with them, maybe some connections that I have in the community, ways that they could raise funds on their own and still see Lucy make that trip and have some financial assistance without it coming out of our student activity funds. Next, as I look at resolving this issue, there's several things that I kept in mind as I made decisions. First of all, what's best for kids? These funds that are raised at the game are for all students, and while they do belong to the Booster Club, they should benefit a large number of students. And this is suggested by the text, Mutter and Parker, as well as by Mr. Stevens himself when he was visiting with Mrs. Bowman. This takes us to the better safeguards for protecting those funds. Those funds are something that could improve our school. And in a community where there have been so many economic struggles recently, they're going to value the protection of those funds as well as themselves as they're volunteering in our school. Finally, it's evident that parent partnership is incredibly important in this school and this community. And instead of engaging in a conversation that might be more toxic and accusatory of those parent volunteers, I'd want to keep things very much focused and framed around protecting those volunteers and protecting the funds moving forward. As I debrief about this situation and think about the things I was thinking and feeling as I made the decisions, I realized that one thing that was important was being fair to everyone involved. I don't want to deprive the students of that $50 that might be missing, but I also don't want to damage relationships with the parent volunteers, with Mrs. Bowman, and I don't want to have them questioning each other. And so I look at that $50 as the cost of moving forward with some new safeguards, and hopefully with those things in place, we won't have a way for that theft to occur. Second of all, I really disliked the feelings of doubt that I had about our parent volunteers, and I really wanted to keep that framed within a position of offering guidance and suggestions. The concerns that I have are really as an advisor from the outside, since the Booster Club is in charge of those funds ultimately. And so keeping those framed as a concern helps to change the safeguards that are in place without damaging those relationships. As for the unresolved issues, one of the concerns I have is the governance of these funds. Seems like they truly belong in the school's activity account. That would give Mr. Stevens more ownership over the way that things operate moving forward. Another question I have is if there are other activities that may be at risk for theft, if they also need some similar safeguards and training in place for parent volunteers. And then finally, I want to make sure we have ways to help students like Lucy to go out and pursue success with those achievements outside of school while still definitely not spending school funds to send them. But maybe we could gather some resources and a place within the community for them to seek that help. To reflect on the management skills involved as a principal here, first of all, there's the managing of fiscal resources. As a principal, I would have some experience with that, but in this situation, I'm taking on more of an advisory role to the Booster Club. I'd encourage them to utilize suggestions from the text School Money Matters for safeguards that would be appropriate when collecting money and managing the tickets. I would already be using those in the school, and so would have an opportunity to maybe model and have some resources available. The second thing is I ultimately have to be able to trust those parent volunteers, and I purposefully am avoiding a divisive, accusatory type of conversation among the parents over what might have happened. So instead, I want to make sure I frame the conversation as a protection to both the parent volunteers as well as the funds. And then finally, it's my responsibility to monitor systems. And so maybe I need to put in place some periodic reviews that would occur for different procedures we have for collecting funds. And maybe there's some changes in the way that those happen that further review would be necessary. So keeping that maybe on a calendar for periodic review would be an appropriate thing. Finally, let's look at Standard 8 and some of the ways that Mr. Stevens is already demonstrating effective and efficient management. First of all, we've got the pre-numbered tickets, the concessions inventory, and parents working in pairs. That's a great start to safeguards. We did identify some additional areas that could improve, but overall it's a great start. As far as promoting social learning, when we look at the actions of Mr. Stevens, we've got students participating in sports and activities, which is a great opportunity for those students and something we'd want to make sure continued as an opportunity. I think it's also important to note that Mr. Stevens knows the parents. He recognizes them, calls them by name, and has that relationship that's also going to help the students in the long run. Finally, the parents obviously feel comfortable in the school. They spend time there volunteering, they come to school events, so those are also important to student success. Finally, when we look at the academic learning, there's evidence of it through the Reading Buddies program the parents volunteer through. And when Mr. Stevens is talking to Mrs. Bowman, he makes sure and stresses the importance of using those funds to the benefit of most or all of the students. So we know that that's an important priority for him. And then finally, he values the parents and the community involvement, and that is going to go a long way towards student academic success. Thank you for the opportunity to examine the Booster Club's missing funds.